Today's topic is going to be about opportunity cost. And for those who don't know, opportunity cost is, to put simply, you have a few choices in front of you, and then you're trying to measure the potential gain you get from each, and then the potential loss you get from not picking one of the other choices. So the reason I'm talking about this is because this is a interesting concept when you're talking about team games, specifically the gamesmanship in the shuffle period. And every team game currently has a specific shuffle period. For League of Legends, it's usually after Worlds. For Dota 2, it's every designated player. It's every designated player shuffle by Valve. And then for CS:GO, generally speaking, it's more laissez-faire, but it's around the end of the major is usually when it is. But it might be that, as far as I know, they're trying to change it so that most players' contracts end around the same time, so it's easier to do the shuffle then. Right. So the reason I wanted to talk about this is because it tells you a lot about whoever is pulling the trigger on the shuffle. So whether that's the organization itself, the captain, or the players within the team, somebody has to make the choice as to what they do. And it's actually a very complicated sort of game, because there are so many different factors, and especially in team games, as to what affects your results or how you're going about things. But basically, one of the first rules, I think, and the most important rule you have to think about is always this: whoever is the best team right now, not within the last few months, but right now, will usually have the strongest bargaining power in the trade. So at that instance, that'll tell you exactly what type of team it is. So for instance, you go to League of Legends last year in NALCS, CLG made this run through the NALCS, and then they beat TSM to win the championship, and then they got second at MSI. At that point of time, if they wanted to make a trade, I think they could have gotten I won't say franchise players, but they could have gotten much better players than they had on that current roster at the time. Upgraded it with firepower, maybe gotten imports, something like that, but they never did. And then so when they went downhill and they needed to do a trade, the chances of that became much harder. And the only reason they ended up getting that trade was because Dardoch happened to have huge problems with, was it Immortals or was it Team Liquid? I think it was Immortals at that point, was having huge problems with Immortals. And so that's the only reason they were able to eventually get Dardoch onto that team. So that's one of the first rules you have to think about, is the position of power, and power is always relative to how strong the team is compared to the other teams that have the prospects they want to trade for. So for instance, in an IP like Sweden, they could never trade for any of the Fnatic players after Fnatic became world champions, basically. Because at that point, not even JW was crazy enough to be like, oh, I should go back to NIP. I always wanted to play with Force and get right. No, at that point, when you're winning that much, I don't think even JW was crazy enough to do it. And then obviously they missed Olaf Meister and Krims from LGB, and they could have gotten Pronax, but they didn't. They could have gotten Flusha probably, but they didn't. If they had extended the talks, maybe they could have got one of them, but they never did. And that's a huge problem when you think about what ended up happening to that NIP lineup, because they would always just do okay, but it would just trail down further and further and further. And this is what I mean by opportunity cost. So during these specific shuffle periods, you're going to have a point where you have to evaluate what is the reasonable expectation for this team right now, going forward, and what is a potential gain you could get if you do the trade, what is a potential loss you can get if you do the trade. So I have two examples from Dota 2 from the last trade period. First, from the Chinese roster, you have one instance, Newbie and LFY, and Newbie and LFY, for those who don't know, had made very deep runs into TI7. Newbie was second, lost to Team Liquid. LFY was third. I'd argue they were the second best team at the event. And neither team made any roster shuffles, despite, I think, both teams needing them. Newbie has always been, throughout 2017, chokers. They, at the very largest of tournaments, they have never been able to close it out. They've never had the clutch or the experience. They're basically missing some kind of factor. And I understand from their point of view as to why they didn't trade. They just made fucking second at TI7. But from outside, how reasonable is it to expect for Newbie to take another year as arguably the best Chinese team in the region for that period of time, and then to eventually get over the hump? I don't think that's a reasonable assumption to make, because we've already seen, I think, the ceiling of this Newbie team, and unless something unlocks in their mind that I can't think of, I don't think there's going to be a potential benefit going forwards. In the same sense, LFY is in the same boat. As a team, LFY was all about that team play. It's all about the drafting. It's all about the strategy. But the individual players on the team are weaker, particularly the mid, Super. Now, I also understand why they didn't do it, because they had a great run at TI also. And more importantly, one of the only players immediately that goes to your mind you want to kick would be Super. But Super had an abnormally good tournament that event, so you're like, okay, give him another shot. But from my perspective, I feel like if LFI wants to become the best team in the world, they're eventually going to have to kick Super, or they're eventually going to have to change somebody else, because they don't have enough pure skill to match the best teams. We've already seen them push their strategic and team play edge to the very end limits. I don't think there's much more they can gain from that. So the only other way they can boost their team as a whole is by getting more skill into it. So that's why in terms of opportunity cost, I feel like they missed a trick here. But I will say there is a certain level of ruthlessness I'm not sure people are willing to go through. It's very hard to just cut somebody after they've done something amazing, unless you're a PPD. So that goes to the next shuffle, or next opportunity cost, which is the EG PPD thing that's going on right now in Dota, where PPD has come back, but he hasn't come back to the original EG roster. And I have to assume at this point it's probably because they just don't want to work with him. Obviously, he's a very stubborn individual, very determined, very iron-willed, so to speak. And while a bunch of the EG players want to win, they don't want to win. They don't want to pay the price to play under him. So that's I feel like that's a huge mistake on their part. I feel like they should have bent the knee. Every single TI run EG has had that went deep were had a huge factor in PPD's leadership and PPD's drafting. And luckily for them, I guess, the Valve rules make it so that the coach can help him draft. But even then, I feel like PPD does bring something into the server that they very much need. But I guess we'll have to see in the coming season, because it's not like I've seen how they look with Fear yet. So maybe there's something there I don't know about. And then you come to CS:GO. The recent shuffles after the Krakow Major. I'll go into just a few of them. I think the most interesting ones you have to think about are FaZe, Astralis, and North. So FaZe, they bombed out of the Krakow Major. You look at the games themselves, there were a lot of bad individual performances, specifically Kiyoshima, Kerrigan were very bad. But even beyond that, I feel like they were just tactically outplayed for a lot of their maps. And then Big surprised them with their strong T side on Inferno. So there were a few circumstances as to why FaZe dropped out of there. But the question is, should FaZe have done the roster shuffle prior to... we can't look at it in hindsight, oh, they shouldn't have done it because they won ESL New York. No, at that point in time, for FaZe at least, they didn't know that the roster shuffle that they were going to make would succeed or not. But look at it from their perspective. They have had problems with practice or so the rumors go. At the same time, they made 4 finals. They lost 3 of them. They won 1. And you look at all those finals, it's not clear cut that they should have won more than 1. I feel like Astralis definitely played better than them. One of them, the one where they beat Astralis could have won. The one where they lost to SK, like FaZe could have won, but it's like a 50-50 for both of those. And then the last one they lost, SK smashed them. So it doesn't really feel like they should have won more finals than that. So the question for FaZe at that point is, what was it that they needed to do to boost that particular lineup with Alu, with Kiyoshima? And you look at the way they played, it feels like in terms of skill, there wasn't much more further you can go. Nico was amazing. Rain was as good as you can hope for. Alu was pretty stable. I don't actually think Alu was a bad player at all. Kiyoshima was surprisingly great support player. Kerrigan was having good impact as an in-game leader type role. So you think about in skill, okay, that's out. What about teamwork? What about tactics? What about maybe a more structured style? This could have been a potential way to fix the team, but the rumor goes that they were having problems with practice, and they had to use live games, as in like online games in the ESL Pro League or something, in order to get them to take it seriously. So that was never going to work, I think. I'm not sure about the internal issues, but if you have to use live games just to practice, I don't think that's sustainable for a long period of time. So the reasonable expectation you can hope for is if they stuck that lineup, I'd say you'd expect top 4s, playoffs every time, top 4s usually, finals, and maybe the odd tournament. I feel like that would have been the max amount you could have gotten from that particular lineup. And obviously that's a very good team. There's no reason to trade. But from FaZe's point of view, and I'm not sure who pulled the trigger, whether it was FaZe or it was Kerrigan, but from their point of view, I feel like they wanted to be the number 1 team. And this is where opportunity cost comes in, because during this roster shuffle period, you have 2 players come out on the market that you will likely never get again, and that is Guardian and Olaf Meister. Guardian obviously ending his long tenure on Na'Vi. Olaf Meister finally leaving Fnatic, and the reason you're likely not going to get them again is because, first off, Guardian is one of those rare off talents that you're not going to see that often in CSGO. Same thing for Olaf Meister. He's one of the great all-time Swedish players, and right now Sweden is in like a problem. It has serious problems in terms of their developing talent, but I don't think it's going to stay that way forever, especially in the scene of Counter-Strike. I feel like eventually new players and new leaders are going to have to rise up from that scene. So for FaZe, if you look at it from Kerrigan's point of view, with this knowledge of everything, you know that if Guardian goes somewhere, he'll likely become the franchise player of whatever team he goes to. Same thing with Olaf Meister. At this point for FaZe, they're probably thinking in their minds, sure, our old lineup with Alu and Kiyoshima, that works. That will get us like this level. But how many chances in our lifetime are we going to be allowed to hire both players at once? Not bloody likely. So I think that's why they pulled the trigger, and fair play to them. They made it work despite my own reservations, despite many people's reservations. And we'll have to see how it goes in the future, but that's probably what they were thinking in terms of just opportunity cost. Yeah, it would be amazing if they won, but at the same time, how many other times are you going to get somebody like Guardian, somebody like Olaf Meister? And the reason I've been thinking about this is specifically the fall off of Astralis and then the rise of North. So North at Krakow Major was completely underwhelming. Yeah, they got to the playoffs, but they lost to a very weak side from Virtus Pro. And I don't mean like tactically weak, I just mean like their individual forms were pretty weak. So they lost to that Virtus Pro, and North through all of 2017 have spent their times getting upset by lesser teams. Immortals, Hellraisers, Chiefs, stuff like this. North have just been underwhelming overall. At the same time, Astralis, yeah, they lost. They also lost in the major, but it was in the semifinals, and it was to Gambit, the eventual winners. So here's the question you have to think about: is at that point in the roster shuffle, Astralis were satisfied. Unlike Kerrigan and FaZe, they were satisfied with their result, and obviously they had a much better result than them. But if you look at the overall like period of time in those months, I'd say FaZe's results were better than Astralis. I'd say all those multiple finals in a row, whereas Astralis were just continually getting top four, right? But I think that's the difference in character between them. Is FaZe wanted to FaZe saw this opportunity, this amazing opportunity, to get two players they will likely never get again. And then Astralis were content with where they were. And this creates an opening for North. And the reason I say it creates an opening for North is because there is a very obvious Danish player that was on the market that everybody wanted to hire, and that was Valde. Valde being a very skilled player, very smart player, and from all the rumors we're hearing, a very good team player. So it's a very rare kind of talent where he might not be a superstar necessarily, but he is a star player, and he will gel with any team he goes to, and he does think about the game in a very cerebral way. So that's the kind of player you want on your team. And not only was Valde on the market, but Astralis could have taken, I think, Config. And Config has arguably been, I'd say top 10 player all year, at least. And within the last few months, I'd say he's like pretty close to breaking into the top 5. And Config is an amazing entry guy, great in second in, but he's also does a good job at lurking, which is where MSL put him throughout most of 2017. So both of these Danish players were on the rise, so to speak. Valde was free from heroic. Config was doing fucking amazing, and North were struggling really badly. At that point in time, if Astralis had given them a contract, I think one of them would have bit the offer. But was that the right choice for Astralis? What were Astralis thinking? What was their reasonable expectation? I feel like they were thinking similar lines to what I was thinking, as in their pure tactical structure was such that it doesn't feel like any particular player is doing a really bad job, even though in individual forms rise and fall, and in their case most of them are falling, they could depend on the system to win. So I feel like a reasonable expectation for them is they'd probably just continue to get round the four, but this didn't happen. They lose to Gambit at Malmo, and then they lose to Liquid at ESL New York. And this is what I mean by opportunity cost, because it's a reasonable expectation to get round the 4 over and over again, but it's also reasonable to say, will they go up? No. Will they go down? Maybe, because all of history shows us that every player rises and falls, and they've already risen to their top, which was E-League Major. At that point, there's only the fall left, so to speak. So if they were looking at it that way, maybe they would have been ruthless enough to say, we have to go get one of these other players to bring them into the team and cut somebody. But they didn't. North, on the other hand, looked at their players and like, okay, it's kind of weird that they kick. All right, I just had a brain freeze, but basically, North basically looked at their players and like, okay, the obvious player we have to cut here is Magisk for them. I think the obvious one would have been AZ myself, but they go with Magisk, and obviously, as far as we know, it was some kind of internal team problem with the way Magisk was playing. And to be fair, they changed his roles a bunch, but it wasn't as if he was doing well in most of his roles. Like the few he had that were still good was cobble long, overpass, mid, but there weren't that many great roles left that Config was doing that well in. So I can see why, but I feel like AZ was a bigger problem. But fair play to North. They bring in Valde. They changed up the rules. They put Valde and Lurk. They put Config back to his original role. They put AZ in a more supportive role, and it's worked out fine so far. But at this point in time, now that Astralis are clearly struggling because they've lost the ESL New York, I don't think it's viable for them to get either Valde or Config. They've basically lost their chance, and it might, and the power, so to speak, of making the change now goes to North because North has the results. North has likely convinced themselves and convinced their players and that they are the best Danish team, and I think just in pure results, you can't really argue against it, at least within the last month. So for them, they get, when the roster shuffle comes, if this trend continues where North is on the rise, Astralis is on the fall, when the trades happen, it will likely go in North's favor. North will be trying to take players from Astralis. At least that's how I think it'll go. So this is why opportunity cost is pretty important when it comes to esports games, just because in the team shuffle, you can't really just shuffle for the hell of it, but you have to understand the opportunity cost, the potential gains and the potential losses. And I will say there are times where you will somebody will fuck up. Like you get a player you think is good, but it doesn't work out. And in which case you kind of ruin yourself, but then you just have to double down. I feel like this is basically what happened with Liquid for a long period of time in both games, League of Legends and CSGO. But they fixed it now, so, well, CSGO anyway. Anyway, that's all for now. See you later.